On a warm May evening in 2001, 17-year-old Melissa Turner locked the glass door of a 7-Eleven on Camp Bowie in Fort Worth, Texas, and started her short walk home. Just 8 minutes. Less than half a mile. A path she knew by heart. But that night, the air was heavy, the streetlights flickered, and shadows clung to the sidewalks like warning signs no one read. Minutes later, her light green jacket appeared in the weeds. A single white sneaker lay abandoned by a rusting bus stop. Pages from her notebook fluttered across the asphalt like desperate cries for help. And then, nothing. No more footprints, no blood, no trail. It was as if Melissa evaporated into the night. By morning, Fort Worth erupted into chaos. Helicopters swept Lake Benbrook. K-9 units prowled empty lots. Volunteers filled the streets. Flyers with Melissa's school photo plastered storefronts and telephone poles. Her mother begged through trembling lips on television, "Please help me bring my daughter home." The entire city leaned forward, waiting for answers that never came. Days turned to months, months into years. Rumors replaced facts. Her case file thickened, then gathered dust in the basement of the police department, labeled simply, "Unsolved." Another entry in the long, haunting ledger we call the cold case files. But here's the truth. Killers make mistakes. Evidence, no matter how small, waits patiently for the right eyes and the right technology. Years later, a preserved scrap of DNA would explode the silence, pulling the mask off a man the community thought they knew. If you follow cold case files, you know the most terrifying monster isn't the stranger in the dark. It's the neighbor standing beside you at the candlelight vigil. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deepest dives into the world of true crime and cold case files. Melissa Turner was 17, with shoulder-length brown hair and a soft smile that rarely left her face. On May 18th, 2001, she finished her shift at the 7-Eleven on Camp Bowie Boulevard just after 10:15 p.m. Her routine was as predictable as the hum of the fluorescent lights inside the store. She would sling her backpack over one shoulder, pull her windbreaker tight against the breeze, wave goodbye to coworkers, and begin the short walk home. The journey should have taken no more than 8 minutes, barely half a mile down a quiet neighborhood route she had traveled countless times before. That night, however, the familiar felt strange. The Texas air carried the leftover heat of a 90-degree day, now pressed into the stillness of evening. The streetlights flickered in the uneven intervals, casting long shadows across patches of cracked sidewalk. Wind stirred the trees, rattling their branches like whispered warnings. Melissa stepped into the darkness, unaware it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. By midnight, her mother Janet sat restless in the living room, a yellow lamp glowing over the clock on the wall. Each tick mocked her patience. 10:30 passed. 11. Then midnight. Melissa's seat at the table was still empty. Fear crept in quietly, then all at once. Janet dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported that her daughter had not come home from work. Within minutes, Fort Worth police logged the case. Missing juvenile, Melissa Turner, age 17. The following morning, the city woke to sirens and urgency. Detectives gathered in a briefing room and repeated a mantra every investigator knows. The first 24 hours are critical. Flyers were printed with Melissa's school photo, her smile frozen in ink, her name in bold red. Officers handed them out at gas stations, supermarkets, and bus stops. Television anchors urged anyone with information to call. In neighborhoods accustomed to suburban calm, unease settled like fog. Within hours, volunteers poured in. Students from Western Hills High School, some still in uniform, combed streets with maps in hand. Teachers, neighbors, and friends distributed posters. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting across Lake Benbrook, where divers searched the murky shallows. K-9 units tracked scents through abandoned lots, their handlers straining to keep up. Even with hundreds searching, the ground gave nothing back. Then came the first discoveries. Less than 300 yards from the 7-Eleven, searchers found a green windbreaker discarded in the dirt, sleeve torn as if pulled during a struggle. Nearby, a single white sneaker lay half hidden in weeds by a rusting bus stop. A little further along the roadside, Melissa's notebook lay open, pages of algebra problems fluttering in the breeze. Close to it, a simple black hair tie, the kind she wore almost every day. The collection of items told a story, but an unfinished one. Investigators marked each piece of evidence, photographed it, and sealed it carefully. No drag marks, no clear footprints, no blood. The trail stopped as suddenly as it began. To detectives, this felt less like a runaway case and more like what they call a blitz abduction, a sudden, overwhelming attack that ends in seconds. Psychologically, cases like these are chilling because they reveal the predator's planning. An opportunistic crime might leave chaos, but this scene was precise, almost clinical. Someone intercepted Melissa in that narrow window between the safety of the store and the sanctuary of her home. Someone watched, waited, and struck. At Western Hills High, students huddled in shock. Melissa's best friend, Sarah Jenkins, broke down while handing out posters, whispering to reporters, "We just want her back." Classmates walked the streets in packs, searching vacant lots and creek beds, refusing to accept their friend could vanish in their own neighborhood. The media swarmed. Local broadcasts replayed Janet Turner's tearful plea. "She has never run away. Please help us." Newspapers splashed the story on front pages. For a moment, Melissa's name was on every tongue in Fort Worth. But behind the coverage, the Turner home was hollow. Robert, her father, drove aimlessly, stapling flyers to telephone poles until his hands were raw. Janet waited by the phone, flinching at every ring, dreading both silence and bad news. If you imagine this was your daughter, you'd feel the same gnawing question. How does a girl walk out of a store, travel less than half a mile, and then vanish as if the night itself swallowed her? That's the torment of cases like this. They leave families in suspended animation, waiting for a call that never comes. Detectives worked the obvious angles. Was it her ex-boyfriend, still hung up on her? A coworker who lied about his shift time? A customer with a history of harassment? Each was interrogated, alibis checked, homes searched. Each time, the trail ended without proof. Technology in 2001 could not squeeze DNA from the faint tissue under her nails. Cameras were grainy, angled wrong, blind to the path she walked. Every tool failed, every hope bent under the weight of silence. By the end of summer, the case slipped into limbo. Volunteers stopped showing up. Reporters turned their lenses elsewhere. The neighborhood returned to ordinary routines, though with locked doors and wary eyes. For the Turner family, there was no routine, only an empty chair, a made-up bed that stayed untouched, and a purple diary filled with the thoughts of a girl who never came home. And so, Melissa's name joined the long list of victims tucked into dusty binders, filed under a single, cruel phrase: cold case files. But if this story already chills you, stay with us. Because the next chapters reveal that killers sometimes hide in plain sight, even volunteering in search parties, even standing beside the grieving family. Before we continue, if you feel this story deserves to be told, comment 1 below. If you think we could tell it better, comment 0. Your feedback shapes how we approach future deep dives into America's most haunting cold case files. By sunrise on May the 19th, 2001, Fort Worth was no longer just a quiet Texas city preparing for another hot day. It had become the stage of a desperate search for a missing girl. Patrol cars lined Camp Bowie Boulevard, their lights flashing across shuttered storefronts. Officers taped off the area around the abandoned bus stop where Melissa's shoe had been found. Helicopters circled overhead, infrared cameras sweeping tree lines and creek beds. Divers slipped into the murky edges of Lake Benbrook, the water swallowing their silhouettes as they searched for a body no one wanted to find. The lieutenant in charge repeated the same warning to every officer. "We are inside the first 24 hours. Do not waste a minute." Everyone knew the grim statistics. After the first day, a missing teenager's chances of survival plummet. That urgency hummed through the city like a second power grid. Melissa's photo was enlarged and printed on hundreds of flyers. Brown hair to the shoulders, 5 feet, 4 inches tall. A familiar high school uniform. Her name in bold red letters. Missing. Officers in the Turner family fanned out, slipping flyers into hands at gas stations, bus stops, grocery stores, and coffee shops. By noon, her image was everywhere, taped to utility poles, stapled on supermarket boards, even posted in church foyers. The sight of that gentle smile against the word missing shook people who had grown comfortable in their routines. Western Hills High School, where Melissa was a student, transformed overnight into a command center. Teachers, classmates, and parents arrived in waves, signing up for search shifts. Groups of teenagers, still in their polos and backpacks, carried maps marked with routes. They scoured trails, wooded lots, and alleys, calling her name into the wind. It was a heartbreaking sight. Kids who should have been worrying about prom dresses and final exams now searching through bushes and culverts for any sign of their friend. Her best friend, Sarah Jenkins, sobbed as she handed out posters at a local strip mall. To a reporter's camera, she whispered through tears, "We just want to bring her home safe." That soundbite looped on television all afternoon, a raw plea that made the story impossible to ignore. The search swelled into the hundreds. Volunteers brought flashlights, bottled water, and homemade sandwiches for exhausted officers. Neighbors who had never spoken to the Turners suddenly appeared on their porch with hugs, prayers, or coffee. A nearby church organized candlelight vigils, the pews filled with strangers clutching posters. For a few days, it felt as if the entire city became one extended family, united in grief and in hope. But beneath the unity ran an undercurrent of fear. Parents who had once let their children walk to the corner store now insisted on driving them everywhere. Families locked their doors before dark, blinds drawn tight. One woman told a local reporter, "If a teenage girl can vanish on a quiet street in our neighborhood, then none of us are safe." Eights. Police pressure mounted with every hour. Investigators canvassed homes near the 7-Eleven, knocking on doors until knuckles bruised. They checked sex offender registries, ran down the names of every employee who had worked with Melissa, and interviewed classmates about her personal life. Some leads appeared promising. A witness claimed to see a red pickup idling near the bus stop. Another thought she spotted Melissa with a group of teens at a Dallas mall. But each lead dissolved under scrutiny, leaving detectives chasing shadows. Meanwhile, the Turner home became the emotional epicenter of the storm. Reporters gathered on the lawn, waiting for statements. Janet Turner, exhausted and trembling, stepped in front of microphones more times than she could count, repeating her plea. "Melissa has never run away. Please help us find her." Her voice cracked each time, but she refused to stop speaking. Robert Turner, less verbal, channeled his pain into action, driving through the city at dawn to plaster more posters on poles, handing them to truckers at rest stops, leaving them in diners with tear-stained hands. Inside the house, the absence of Melissa was deafening. Her bedroom remained untouched. Bed neatly made, Britney Spears posters on the wall, her purple diary sitting on the desk as if waiting for its owner to return. At dinner, her younger sister Emily still set an extra plate, then broke into tears when silence filled the empty chair. For investigators, the physical evidence remained maddeningly vague. A torn jacket, a single sneaker, notebook pages, and a hair tie. No drag marks. No fingerprints that could be lifted. No surveillance camera covering the road between the 7-Eleven and her home. Detectives began to consider the terrifying possibility that this was the work of someone who knew Melissa's route intimately, someone who could predict her every move. The city tried to hold on to hope, but, with every passing day, optimism frayed. Local newspapers ran front-page headlines like, 17-year-old girl mysteriously vanishes, and community unites in search. Television anchors ended each broadcast with Melissa's photo. Yet, as tips poured in, many proved to be false, born out of desperation or cruel imagination. Still, the sheer scale of the search left its mark. If you were living in Fort Worth at the time, you couldn't walk a block without seeing Melissa's face. And perhaps that's why her case lingered in memory long after the searchlights dimmed. She became not just a missing teenager, but a symbol of how fragile safety can feel. Years later, when her name would reappear in the headlines as part of the reopened cold case files, residents remembered the heat of that summer, the endless flyers, and the haunting silence when the first 24 hours slipped away without answers. This was more than an investigation. It was a collective trauma, an entire community forced to acknowledge that, even in familiar neighborhoods, darkness waits at the edges of the light. Before we move forward, I want to hear from you. If you think stories like this deserve to be told to honor victims and keep pressure on the truth, comment 1 below. If you think we can improve how we share these cold case files, comment 0. Your voice helps decide how we continue bringing these true stories to life. The longer Melissa stayed missing, the more the weight shifted from the city to the Turner household. In the first days, neighbors poured through the door with casseroles, coffee, and words of support. By the end of the second week, the house felt quieter, and grief began pressing against the walls like an unseen storm. Robert Turner, a construction worker by trade, was not a man of many words. His grief showed in motion. Each morning, he rose before sunrise, drove his old pickup through the streets of Fort Worth, and plastered new flyers onto every telephone pole he could reach. He did it in the Texas heat, his shirt soaked, his calloused hands raw from staples and tape. To drivers passing by, he looked like a man on a mission. To those who knew him, he looked like a father refusing to accept silence as an answer. Janet, Melissa's mother, carried her grief differently. She was the one facing cameras, sitting in newsrooms under harsh lights, her face pale with exhaustion. Every time a microphone was thrust in front of her, she repeated the words she needed the city to hear. Melissa has never run away. She is out there. Please help us. She cried often, but never during interviews. The tears came later, alone in her daughter's bedroom, where Britney Spears posters stared down from the walls and a purple diary remained unopened on the desk. Inside the house, the emptiness grew louder with each day. At dinner, 3 chairs were filled, but a 4th remained empty. Emily, Melissa's younger sister, often placed a plate in front of that empty chair. Sometimes she even served food onto it, hoping that some ritual of love might bring her sister back. But when the chair stayed empty, the little girl broke down, sobbing into her mother's arms. Psychologists often describe grief in families of missing persons as ambiguous loss, a state where the loved one is gone but not confirmed dead. It paralyzes decision-making. Do you keep the bedroom exactly as it was, or do you pack it away? Do you cling to hope or prepare for the worst? The Turners chose preservation. Melissa's room became a shrine, untouched as if she might walk through the door at any moment. For Janet, it was a way to keep her daughter alive in the house. For Robert, the sight of that room was unbearable. He avoided it entirely, knowing that every glance was a fresh wound. The family's pain also became a spectacle. Reporters camped outside, hoping to capture raw moments. Strangers knocked on the door, offering tips or rumors, most of them useless, some of them cruel. One night, the phone rang and a voice on the other end claimed Melissa had been spotted in Oklahoma. Another caller insisted she had run off with an older boyfriend. Each false lead raised hope only to crush it. For Janet, the rumors were daggers, accusations that her daughter had chosen to abandon them. She erupted in anger during one interview, shouting, "My daughter would never run away. She is not that kind of girl." 8. Rumor is its own predator. In many cold case files, false narratives derail investigations and isolate families. The Turners lived that nightmare. Friends who once offered help began pulling back, unsure of what to believe. Some avoided the family altogether, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Emily, only 12 years old, carried the weight of whispers at school. Her classmates didn't know how to talk to her, so many simply stayed away. The little girl who once laughed easily now sat alone at lunch, staring at the floor. Robert's silence deepened. He poured himself into work, then into late-night drives across the city, scanning streets for a glimpse of his daughter. He grew more solitary, more unreachable. Janet shouldered the public fight while also managing Emily's heartbreak. The marriage strained under the pressure. When couples lose a child, psychologists note that grief often divides them. One clings to action, the other to memory. Both are trying to survive, but in different languages. And yet, the Turners refused to let Melissa's name fade. Janet organized vigils, small at first, then larger as churches joined. Candles lined sidewalks, their flicker a fragile echo of hope. Neighbors walked in silence, holding posters above their heads. A pastor prayed for protection, for answers, for mercy, for the family. These moments offered temporary relief. They reminded them that Melissa's absence was not just their private wound, but a community's shared burden. Still, as summer stretched into fall, fatigue set in. The number of volunteers shrank. Media attention shifted to other stories. Flyers curled and peeled from poles. Search dogs were recalled to other assignments. The silence of unanswered questions grew heavier. At night, Janet sat by the window, porch light glowing like a beacon into the empty street. She whispered to herself, sometimes aloud, "If you're out there, come home. Please." 8. You may wonder how long you could endure such uncertainty. Days? Weeks? Imagine months slipping by without a single answer. That's what ambiguous loss does. It freezes time, suspends healing, and traps families between denial and despair. Emily, in her innocence, once wrote a letter to the Fort Worth police chief. In shaky handwriting, she begged them not to give up. "My sister promised to teach me to drive. She promised to take me to a concert this summer. Please find her." Officers who read it admitted they cried. For a 12-year-old, the pain was raw, uncomplicated, and impossible to ignore. The Turner family's story illustrates the deep psychological toll these cases leave behind. They were not just victims of a crime, they were victims of uncertainty. And while the evidence sat in bags in a police storage room, preserved but powerless, their lives unraveled around it. Years later, when Melissa's name resurfaced in the reopened cold case files, these memories came rushing back. Reporters revisited the family, asking them to recall the summer of 2001. Janet's face was lined with years of grief, Robert's voice quieter, Emily now an adult carrying scars from adolescence. For them, the pain had never left. It had simply grown quieter, like an ember that refuses to go out. This is why cases like Melissa's matter. They remind us that crime is not just about evidence, suspects, and trials. It's about empty chairs, unopened diaries, and families suspended in grief. It's about the cruel way silence can echo louder than truth. And now, I want to bring you into this story. If you believe stories like Melissa's must be told, to honor the families, to expose the predators, to remind us of what's at stake, comment 1 below. If you think we can do more to improve how we tell these stories and present these cold case files, comment 0. Your voice helps shape how these cases are remembered and how justice is pursued, even decades later. As weeks blurred into months, the Turner family carried their grief like a second skin. The porch light stayed on every night, a beacon against the dark. But behind the police station doors, the investigation slowed. Leads that had once seemed urgent dissolved into fragments. The red pickup sighting proved baseless. The girl at the Dallas Mall wasn't Melissa. The co-worker's alibi, while suspicious, could not be broken. And so, the silence returned. For detectives, the frustration was suffocating. They had evidence, but not the kind that could sing in 2001. The torn jacket, the single shoe, notebook pages in a hair tie, tissue preserved under fingernails, hairs in a sealed envelope. Each piece was logged, labeled, and filed away with meticulous care. But the lab reports carried the same refrain: insufficient sample for analysis. In that year, DNA technology simply couldn't pull a full profile from what Melissa left behind. The case didn't close. It cooled. And in the chilling language of police work, Melissa Turner became another entry in the ever-thickening binder of cold case files. Officers still remembered her smile, her mother's plea, but they had no more tools to chase the truth. For the Turners, the transition from active search to cold case felt like betrayal. Robert kept stapling flyers long after volunteers stopped showing up. Janet continued giving interviews, though fewer cameras came. Emily grew quieter, retreating from classmates who didn't know how to face her grief. The family's life splintered, caught in that cruel limbo where hope and despair exist side by side. Detectives knew the statistics. After the first 48 hours, survival chances drop. After 6 months, recovery without evidence is nearly impossible. But the human heart doesn't live by statistics. Janet clung to rituals, lighting candles, visiting the untouched bedroom, whispering goodnight to her daughter's empty bed. Robert clung to the road, leaving Melissa's face on every corner of Fort Worth. Emily clung to silence, her letter to the police chief tucked away as if she had already said all she could. By the end of 2001, the rhythm of the case had shifted into something darker. Yearly reviews, not daily hunts. A detective might pull the file, flip through old reports, and sigh. A witness might be recontacted, but nothing new emerged. Evidence remained locked in storage, preserved but impotent. The once bright and urgent headlines faded into smaller columns, then disappeared from print altogether. And yet, in that silence lay the math of cold cases, the accumulation of details that wait for science to evolve. Investigators know this well. Time is both the enemy and the ally. The enemy, because witnesses forget, families fracture, rumors harden into false beliefs. But the ally, because evidence doesn't lie, and technology rarely stands still. Inside the Fort Worth Police Department, Melissa's file sat among hundreds. Detectives who handled it admitted later they felt haunted by its incompleteness. They could picture the torn sleeve, the fluttering notebook pages, the single shoe left on a lonely roadside. They suspected abduction, even murder, but without proof, the case drifted into the quiet gray zone where justice hibernates. For the Turners, the years 2002 and 2003 brought only more distance. The marriage crumbled under the weight of absence. Robert moved into a small apartment near the industrial area. Janet stayed in the old house with Emily, guarding Melissa's room as though time could not touch it. Emily entered her teenage years, marked not by milestones, but by anniversaries. Each May 18th, a wound reopened. This is the cruel arithmetic of loss. Every day without answers is compounded by the next. Families begin to live two lives. One in the world of the present, another trapped in the night of the disappearance. And when cases like Melissa's sink into the binders of cold case files, they carry not only evidence, but the weight of fractured families and broken communities. Still, hope lingered, faint but alive. Each year, detectives promised to review the file. Each year, Janet told reporters she still believed. Each year, Emily left the porch light burning on the anniversary, waiting for a miracle. They didn't know it then, but time was slowly turning. The DNA samples preserved in 2001 would one day speak. The torn jacket, the tissue under fingernails, the sealed envelopes in evidence lockers, they would become louder than rumors, stronger than silence. But for now, in the early 2000s, all that remained was grief, faith, and the fragile belief that truth, however long delayed, could not be buried forever. For 14 years, Melissa Turner's case sat dormant, her name little more than a whisper in the archives of Fort Worth's cold case files. Life moved forward around the Turners, though their grief never did. Flyers weathered and peeled. Vigils dwindled. Melissa became a memory frozen at 17, her face fading from the city's collective memory. Then, in the summer of 2015, the earth itself shifted. Construction crews were clearing land near Lake Benbrook, just 5 miles from the 7-Eleven where Melissa was last seen. Bulldozers scraped soil, preparing the foundation for a new suburban development. One worker, guiding an excavator, noticed something pale in the dirt. At first, he assumed it was animal bone. But as more soil turned, the unmistakable curve of a human skull emerged from the gravel. The site shut down immediately. Police were called. By afternoon, crime scene tape cordoned off the area, and a forensic tent rose in the Texas heat. The city that had almost forgotten was suddenly pulled back into a nightmare. Detective Laura Morales, by then a key member of the cold case unit, arrived within hours. She stared at the shallow pit, heart pounding. She knew instantly what the discovery could mean. For years she had pored over Melissa's file, rereading the faded notes, reviewing the sealed evidence that once led nowhere. Now, the possibility of closure stood exposed in the dirt. The forensic team worked methodically, brushing away soil with small tools, sifting layer by layer. What they uncovered told a haunting story. Skeletal remains, tattered fabric, a purple plastic bracelet, and fragments of a white sneaker matching what Melissa wore that night in 2001. Each piece was photographed, cataloged, and carefully lifted into evidence bags. At the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office, DNA was extracted from the remains. Days later, the results confirmed the truth. The bones were Melissa Turner's. After nearly a decade and a half, the girl who vanished on her short walk home had finally been found. For Janet Turner, the confirmation landed like a blow and a relief in the same breath. She wept until her body shook, whispering through tears, "At least now she can rest." For Robert, the news came by phone. He sat silently in his small apartment, staring at the wall, unable to speak more than a choked, "So, it's really over." Emily, now 26, held her mother close, her own tears streaming as she whispered, "We can finally bring her home." Eights. The funeral was simple but crowded. Old classmates returned, now grown, standing shoulder to shoulder with teachers and neighbors. Melissa's high school photo rested on the altar, her smile forever 17. Candles lined the pews. People who hadn't spoken her name in years bowed their heads. But for detectives, the discovery was more than closure. It was ignition. Morales looked at the skeletal remains, then at the dusty evidence box still preserved from 2001. The thought struck her. Now the case could move forward. The DNA that once resisted testing could finally speak. This wasn't just an end. It was a beginning. And if you've followed enough cold case files, you know this is where science transforms grief into pursuit. Evidence doesn't fade. It waits. And when technology catches up, it can rip the mask off the most careful predator. Melissa Turner's remains reignited the investigation. The cold case unit prepared to test, to question, to challenge everything once considered dead ends. For the Turners, closure was bittersweet. They had their daughter back, but justice was still missing. If you believe discoveries like this prove why we must never give up on the forgotten, comment 1 below. If you think we can make these stories stronger, clearer, or more powerful, comment 0. Your voice ensures these cold case files keep breathing life until justice is served. For years, Melissa Turner's evidence box had sat untouched, sealed with yellow tape, tucked into the metal shelves of the Fort Worth Police Department's basement. Inside were the artifacts of her final walk. The torn windbreaker, the single sneaker, strands of hair, the notebook pages, and most crucially, tiny tissue samples scraped from beneath her fingernails. In 2001, these fragments were frustrating dead ends, insufficient for analysis, the reports read. By 2015, they had become priceless. Detective Laura Morales understood the significance the moment she held the box again. The discovery of Melissa's remains at Lake Benbrook meant closure for the family, but for Morales, it was also a key turning point. The case could finally move forward with the full arsenal of 21st century science. The cold case unit approved immediate retesting. The evidence was carefully transported to Orem Lab in the Woodlands, Texas, a facility specializing in degraded and historic samples. Technicians opened the sealed envelopes, examining fibers from the jacket, swabbing stains that might contain trace fluids, and placing the fingernail scrapings under microscopes. Machines whirred through the night, amplifying fragments of DNA once too small to read. Within weeks, the lab produced a miracle. A complete DNA profile that did not belong to Melissa. For the first time in 14 years, investigators had the genetic fingerprint of her attacker. Morales stared at the report with tears brimming in her eyes. It was proof that Melissa had fought back, and that her killer had left a trace. The DNA was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's national database. But the screen flashed back cold, empty. No match. The perpetrator had never been arrested, never had a sample stored. The silence was devastating, but Morales wasn't ready to give up. By 2015, a new frontier was emerging in the world of cold case files. Genetic genealogy. Companies like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA allowed ordinary people to upload their DNA to find relatives, build family trees, and trace ancestry. Investigators had begun using these databases to track violent offenders through their distant cousins. Morales knew this was their best chance. With approval from her commander, the unknown profile from Melissa's evidence was uploaded. The system ran comparisons across millions of samples. At first, the results looked disappointing. No immediate relatives, just a scattering of distant matches. third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a tiny slice of DNA with the suspect. But genealogy is a puzzle, and every piece matters. Technicians at Orem Lab began building family trees from those distant matches, tracing branches backward to common ancestors, then forward to living descendants. The web narrowed slowly, from hundreds of names to dozens, then finally to a handful of men who could not be ignored. The data pointed to a single surname: Miller. Three brothers who had grown up in Fort Worth in the 1970s, each with a different path in life. One had moved to Houston years before Melissa vanished. Another was stationed with the Marines in California at the time. The last remained in Fort Worth, living quietly only a few blocks from the Turner family. His name was David Miller. When Morales saw it, a chill ran through her. David's name had never appeared in the 2001 investigation. He had no criminal record, no obvious connection to Melissa, nothing that would have raised suspicion. But genealogy didn't lie. The man who left his DNA under her fingernails belonged to the Miller family, and David's geography made him impossible to ignore. Looking back through old newspaper clippings, Morales noticed something that turned her stomach. Photos from the early search parties showed David Miller among the volunteers, walking with neighbors, stapling flyers, even placing a hand on Robert Turner's shoulder. For 14 years, he had stood beside the family, a silent participant in their grief. This was the moment when science finally spoke louder than silence. What eyewitnesses couldn't recall, what cameras failed to capture, what the city had forgotten, DNA revealed. Melissa Turner's case, long frozen in the cold case files, had been ripped open by technology. Morales closed the genealogy report, her notebook filled with underlined names and timelines. She knew the next phase would be delicate. Surveillance. Collection of a fresh DNA sample. Every step had to be flawless. Because if science was right, and she believed it was, Fort Worth's most enduring mystery was about to collide with the face of a man the community thought they knew. If you believe technology like this is the key to giving voices back to the silenced, comment 1 below. If you think we can tell these stories with even more power, comment 0. Either way, your feedback keeps us pushing forward with the truth hidden in these cold case files. Once the genealogical research narrowed the suspect pool to the Miller family, one name stood in bold: David Miller. A quiet man in his 50s who had lived just 3 blocks from the Turners back in 2001. He worked odd jobs as a refrigeration repairman, drove an aging silver pickup, and rarely drew attention. To neighbors, he was polite, almost forgettable. To Detective Laura Morales, he was now the prime suspect in a case that had haunted Fort Worth for nearly 2 decades. But science alone wasn't enough. The DNA profile pulled from Melissa's fingernails was powerful, but legally, investigators needed fresh confirmation. A direct sample from David Miller himself. And that meant one thing: surveillance. For weeks, the cold case unit shadowed his life. They learned his routines, the early drives to repair jobs, the quick stops at McDonald's for coffee, the evenings spent alone in a modest home. They watched from parked cars, through rain-streaked windshields, cameras clicking in silence. Each observation was logged, each movement mapped. Morales knew this phase was delicate. If Miller sensed he was being watched, he could destroy evidence, flee, or even lash out. They couldn't afford mistakes. The strategy was simple. Wait for him to discard something, anything, that might carry his DNA. A cigarette butt, a soda can, a coffee cup. The opportunity came one February morning in 2019. As usual, Miller pulled into a McDonald's off Camp Bowie Boulevard. He ordered a large black coffee, sat in the corner booth, and drank slowly while reading a newspaper. From across the street, Morales sat in an unmarked van, her eyes fixed on the window. Her pulse quickened. This could be it. Miller finished his coffee, crumpled the cup slightly, and set it on the table. A few minutes later, he walked out the door, newspaper tucked under his arm. He didn't look back. The moment he drove away, an undercover officer slipped inside, crossed casually to the booth, and scooped up the discarded cup. To other customers, it looked like trash duty. To Morales, it was potentially the key to solving an 18-year-old mystery. The officer placed the cup into an evidence bag, sealed it, and delivered it to the waiting van. Morales stared at the bag through the clear plastic, her heart racing. This was the closest she had ever come to holding the truth in her hands. The cup was rushed to the forensic lab. Technicians swabbed the rim where Miller's lips had touched, amplifying the genetic material extracted. Days later, the results came back. Morales sat with the lab director as the data loaded on the computer screen. Two profiles appeared side by side. The unknown DNA taken from Melissa Turner's fingernails in 2001, and the fresh sample from David Miller's coffee cup. The comparison software highlighted each marker. One by one, the lines matched. The final result flashed across the screen. 100% probability. For a long moment, no one spoke. Morales leaned back in her chair, her throat tight. After 18 years of silence, denial, and grief, the case had broken open. Science had spoken, and it spoke with absolute certainty. The DNA under Melissa Turner's fingernails belonged to David Miller. The weight of that truth was staggering. Here was a man who had joined search parties, stapled flyers, even placed a comforting hand on Robert Turner's shoulder. For nearly 2 decades, he had lived quietly among the very people he had deceived. And all along, the proof had been trapped beneath a teenage girl's fingernails, waiting for technology to catch up. In that moment, Morales didn't feel triumph. She felt the gravity of betrayal, the cruelty of a neighbor hiding in plain sight, the devastation of a family robbed not just of a daughter, but of trust in their own community. Still, she knew what had to come next. An arrest. The cold case unit prepared their reports. Prosecutors reviewed the chain of custody, the lab's methodology, the rock-solid DNA evidence. The case that had been filed away under cold case files for so many years now burned with urgency. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was imminent. If you believe the smallest trace of evidence, like a discarded cup, can change the course of justice, comment 1. If you think we can make these stories even stronger in how we uncover the truth in cold case files, comment 0. Your voice keeps these cases alive. With the DNA results confirmed, the cold case unit moved quickly. Prosecutors signed off, and a judge approved the arrest warrant. The man who had lived quietly for 18 years, attending neighborhood cookouts and even searching for Melissa alongside her grieving family, was about to face the truth he had buried beneath layers of silence. At dawn, the street outside David Miller's modest Fort Worth home transformed. SWAT vehicles rolled in under a gray sky. Neighbors peered through blinds as armored officers fanned out, weapons ready. A loudspeaker cut through the stillness. David Miller, this is the Fort Worth Police Department. Step outside with your hands visible. 8. The front door opened slowly. Miller appeared in a faded t-shirt and pajama pants, his face slack with disbelief. He raised his hands as commands barked from every direction. Cuffs clicked around his wrists. The quiet neighbor who once taped missing posters to street poles was now paraded past flashing lights and shocked onlookers. Some neighbors gasped, covering their mouths. Others whispered, "I can't believe it. He helped us look for her." The betrayal rippled down the block like a tremor. For Morales, watching from the surveillance van, the moment was heavy. Not triumph, but gravity. Justice was finally moving forward. Inside the interrogation room, the mood shifted. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the metal table. Miller sat slumped in a chair, orange jumpsuit stark against pale walls. Across from him, Detective Morales placed a thin file on the table. Her voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Miller, we need to hear your story." "Eights." He shook his head, muttering, "I didn't know her. I never spoke to her." His denial was steady, but his hands trembled against the cuffs. The detectives pressed him. Where was he on the night of May 18th, 2001? Why had his DNA been found beneath Melissa's fingernails? Why did he join the volunteer searches if he had nothing to hide? Miller deflected, stammered, fell silent. His answers were fractured, unconvincing. Then Morales slid the lab report across the table. 2 profiles side by side. One from the evidence stored since 2001. The other from his discarded coffee cup. A perfect match. For a moment, he froze. His jaw tightened. His veins swelled at the temple. He lowered his head, fists clenching. The room filled with silence so thick it was suffocating. And this is where you can almost feel yourself sitting in that chair across from him, watching a man realize that 18 years of deception have crumbled in seconds. The denial, the mask of innocence, all collapsing under the weight of science. Finally, he muttered, "I want a lawyer." "Eights." The words ended the interrogation. No confession. No apology. Just silence. The final refuge of a man cornered. Morales leaned back, her expression hard but steady. She didn't need his confession. DNA had already spoken louder than words ever could. Outside the room, officers prepared the press release. The cold case that haunted Fort Worth for nearly 2 decades was no longer unsolved. David Miller was charged with the murder of Melissa Turner. For the Turner family, the news came with both relief and agony. The man who once stood beside them at candlelight vigils was the very man responsible for their loss. For the community, the arrest was a chilling revelation. Danger had lived not in the shadows, but next door. The case, once buried deep in the cold case files, was finally alive with answers. But the trial ahead promised to reopen every wound, forcing a family and a city to face the darkest truth of all. The trial of David Miller began in September 2019, nearly 18 years after Melissa Turner vanished. By then, the story had become more than a neighborhood tragedy. It was a test case, proof that science and persistence could resurrect the truth buried in the cold case files. Inside the Tarrant County Courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Reporters filled every seat along the back rows, their pens ready, cameras waiting outside the heavy wooden doors. In the front sat Janet and Emily Turner, holding each other's hands tightly. Robert, quieter than ever, kept his gaze fixed forward. For the family, this wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Prosecutor Michael Grant opened with the image of Melissa's smiling school photo. His voice rang steady as he told the jury. Melissa Turner fought back. The proof is beneath her fingernails. And that proof matches only one man, David Miller. Eights. The case unfolded piece by piece. Forensic experts explained how DNA samples, once unreadable, had been preserved for years. How next-generation sequencing brought clarity. How the coffee cup discarded at McDonald's confirmed what the fingernails revealed. Detective Morales testified about genealogy, surveillance, and the final match. Slide after slide of evidence silenced the courtroom. The defense countered with doubt. Miller's attorney argued, DNA proves contact, not murder. My client lived in the same neighborhood, He volunteered to help in the search. It is possible his DNA transferred during those moments. 8. But the prosecution struck back. No handshake leaves DNA beneath fingernails. No casual contact rips a sleeve or leaves fibers embedded in a jacket. Melissa Turner fought for her life, and her attacker left his signature in the process. 8. Witnesses recalled Miller's unsettling presence in the community years earlier. One former 7-Eleven employee testified that Melissa mentioned being uncomfortable with the way he looked at her. Neighbors described his habit of lingering near the store at night. Combined with the DNA, the narrative was undeniable. After days of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. The courtroom waited in a silence so heavy it seemed the air itself could shatter. Hours stretched into 2 days. Finally, the jurors returned, faces grave, eyes fixed ahead. The foreman rose, voice steady but somber. We, the jury of Tarrant County, find the defendant, David Miller, guilty of first-degree murder. 8. A ripple of gasps moved through the room. Janet collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Robert pressed his palms over his face, his body trembling. After nearly 2 decades of torment, the Turners finally heard the word they had prayed for. Guilty. The judge's sentence followed swiftly. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Miller sat motionless, eyes hollow, the quiet mask of a man who had lived a lie now stripped away forever. For Fort Worth, the verdict was both closure and devastation. The predator had not been a stranger lurking in the shadows, but a neighbor who helped tape missing posters. For the Turner family, justice arrived, but too late to bring Melissa home alive. The gavel struck, and with it, 18 years of unanswered questions collapsed into a single truth. 18 years. That's how long it took for the truth to break free from the shadows of Fort Worth. David Miller will spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the sentence came far too late for the Turner family. They found justice, but not healing. Melissa's smile will never return to their dinner table, and the quiet streets where she walked will always echo with absence. And yet, her story proves something powerful. Silence does not last forever. Evidence doesn't disappear. Technology, perseverance, and the human will to fight for truth can transform the most fragile clue into a voice that demands justice. When you think about Melissa's case, you can almost feel the weight of those years, the loneliness of a mother keeping her daughter's room untouched, the quiet determination of a father stapling flyers until his hands bled, the silence of a sister who grew up without the person she loved most. These are the scars that cold case files leave behind. But they also remind us of something else. Vigilance. That sometimes danger isn't a faceless stranger, but a familiar neighbor who hides in plain sight. That rumors can wound as deeply as silence. And that persistence by families, by detectives, by communities, can eventually bend time in favor of the truth. So, what does Melissa Turner's story leave you with? Perhaps a sense of unease. Perhaps anger. Perhaps hope. But above all, a reminder. We cannot forget the names inside the cold case files. Because each file isn't just paper, it's a life, a family, a voice waiting to be heard. If Melissa's story moved you, comment 1. If you think we can tell these cases even more powerfully, comment 0. And don't forget to subscribe, because every story we share keeps the memory of the lost alive.